The bullet train sliced through the night, a sleek shadow racing across the countryside. Inside, the passengers were nestled in their seats, tired from their long day, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the train's engines. It was almost midnight. The lights inside the train cast a soft glow, just enough to keep the edges of the shadows at bay. The darkness outside the windows seemed thick, swallowing up everything beyond the glass. In carriage 7, a man sat near the window, staring at the black void outside. His name was Daniel, and he was headed home after a business trip that had dragged on longer than he had hoped. The train, the last one for the night, was mostly empty. A few passengers slept, some listened to music, and others, like Daniel, sat in silence. The train had just pulled out of a station, the name of which Daniel hadn't caught. He felt a sudden chill creep through the carriage, as though the air had dropped a few degrees. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, but didn't think much of it. Just a cold draft, he assumed. As the train picked up speed again, Daniel's eyes wandered to the reflection in the window. Something wasn't right. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he saw. In the glass, he could see his own reflection, but behind him, just a few rows back, there was a figure. A person dressed in black, their face obscured by a hood. Daniel blinked and turned his head to look directly at the seat, but it was empty. His heart gave a single hard thump. Maybe he was more tired than he thought. Shaking it off, he turned back to the window, but the figure was still there in the reflection, closer now, standing just a few feet behind him. He whipped his head around again, eyes scanning the rows of seats. Nothing. No one was standing there. His pulse quickened as he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, just a trick of the dim light and the reflections. But his skin prickled with unease. The train swayed gently as it raced forward, the landscape outside nothing more than a blur. Daniel glanced around at the other passengers. They seemed unaware, lost in their own worlds. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Maybe he needed to sleep. He let his head rest against the seat and tried to relax. The train's hum was soothing, and soon he felt his muscles loosening. A sudden, sharp sound shattered the calm. It was like the screech of metal on metal, and the train lurched violently. Passengers were jolted awake, startled cries filling the carriage. Daniel's eyes flew open, and he gripped the armrest as the train shuddered and slowed down, its high-pitched whine echoing in the small space. The lights flickered. For a few seconds, the carriage was plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by the sporadic flashes from the emergency lights. When the main lights came back on, they were dimmer than before, casting long, eerie shadows across the rows of seats. The train slowed to a stop. They hadn't been scheduled for another stop for miles. Daniel leaned forward, trying to peer down the aisle, but the train doors remained closed. There was no station, no sign of life outside. Just the oppressive darkness pressing against the windows. An uneasy murmur spread through the passengers. Daniel's unease deepened. He looked out of the window, seeing only his own pale reflection staring back at him. And then, something moved in the glacé shadow that wasn't his. He turned sharply, his gaze snapping toward the aisle. A dark figure stood at the far end of the carriage, draped in a long black cloak. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Daniel could feel its gaze fixed on him, cold and heavy. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. The aisle was empty, just as it had been moments before. He looked around at the other passengers, but no one seemed to have noticed. He stood up, his legs shaky. Slowly, he made his way down the aisle, past the other passengers, who were either asleep or lost in their phones. His eyes flicked toward the seats where he had seen the figure in the reflection earlier. Nothing. The seat was empty. Just as he was about to turn back, the train jolted again. The lights flickered once more, and the sound of something scraping along the roof echoed through the carriage. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder, as though something or someone was dragging itself across the top of the train. Daniel's heart raced. He looked up, his mind spinning. There was no way anyone could be on the roof. They were going over 200 miles an hour. He hurried back to his seat, his eyes darting toward the windows. Outside, everything was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow inside the train. He glanced at the reflection again, half expecting to see the figure there, standing behind him once more. And it was. This time, it was closer. So close he could almost feel its cold breath on the back of his neck. His pulse quickened, and he gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles turning white. He turned around, and the seat behind him was empty, as always. But he could still feel something there, lurking just out of sight. The train's engines whirred back to life, and with a jolt, they were moving again, speeding through the night. The lights were dimmer now, casting eerie shadows across the seats. Daniel's skin crawled as the sense of unease grew stronger. He wasn't alone. He could feel that something watching him, something close. He turned again, scanning the carriage. The figure was gone, but the air felt thick, suffocating. His eyes flicked to the ceiling, and the scraping noise returned, louder this time. It was moving fast, as though something was racing along the roof, keeping pace with the train. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The carriage fell into an unnatural silence. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as though the air itself had been sucked out of the train. Daniel's ears rang in the quiet. Then, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the carriage. They were soft, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. They came from the far end of the train, moving steadily closer. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. He looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds. The footsteps drew nearer. He could hear the faint swish of fabric, like a cloak dragging along the floor. Closer and closer, the sound approached, until it stopped just behind him. Daniel froze. His entire body tensed as he felt a cold presence at his back. Slowly, he turned his head, just enough to catch a glimpse out of the corner of his eye. The figure stood directly behind him, its face hidden beneath the hood. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He bolted from his seat, stumbling into the aisle. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, his eyes locked on the empty seat where the figure had been. The other passengers stirred, some of them looking up at him in confusion, but none seemed to notice the figure. It was as if it was only visible to him. The train jerked again, its speed increasing as it raced through the night. The lights flickered, casting the carriage into brief moments of darkness. And every time the lights came back on, the figure was there, standing in a different place, always just out of reach. Daniel ran toward the next carriage, desperate to get away, but no matter how far he went, he could feel it following him. The cold presence never left his side. In the next carriage, a woman sat alone, staring out the window. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel slowed as he approached her, noticing the way her hands trembled. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you see it too?" she asked, her voice shaking. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "They've been watching us," she continued, her eyes darting nervously around the carriage. "They've been here the whole time. But no one else can see them." Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse racing. He didn't want to believe her, but he couldn't deny what he had seen, what he was still seeing. The figure was there, just at the edge of his vision, always watching. "We can't escape," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "Once you see them, they never leave you." Daniel's stomach twisted in fear. He wanted to run, to get off the train, but there was nowhere to go. The train hurtled forward, faster and faster, the scenery outside nothing but a blur. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the carriage into darkness. When they came back on, the woman was gone. Her seat was empty, as if she had never been there at all. Panic surged through Daniel. He stumbled back, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The cold presence was back, closer than ever. He could feel it pressing in on him, suffocating him. The train's whistle echoed through the night, a long, mournful sound. The carriage began to shake violently, as though the train was being pulled in all directions at once. Daniel clung to the seat for support, his knuckles white. And then, everything stopped. The train screeched to a halt, the lights flickering once more before going out completely. Silence. Daniel stood frozen, his breath shallow and rapid. He couldn't see anything in the pitch-black darkness, but he could feel them. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding him, watching him. The door to the carriage creaked open.